Two people can disappear from each other's lives and still be trapped inside the same nervous system. Silence is not the end of a relationship. Silence is where the relationship goes to hide. When both people stop reaching out, something strange begins to happen inside the mind that neither person expects. The avoidant does not feel free. The one left behind does not feel closed. What actually happens in that quiet space is a psychological event most people never learn to recognize because it does not look like heartbreak. It looks like peace. It looks like healing. It looks like moving on. But underneath that calm surface, both nervous systems are running a program neither person consciously chose, and that program is rewriting how each of them will love, trust, and abandon themselves for years to come. What you are about to learn is not about him. It is not about her. It is about the architecture of the human mind under abandonment, and once you see it, you will never experience silence the same way again. Silence between two people who once shared everything is not empty. It is loaded. It carries more psychological weight than any conversation ever could, because inside that silence, both minds are forced to face something they spent the entire relationship avoiding. The avoidant person is finally alone with the very feelings they built an identity around escaping. The other person, often mistaken for the emotionally healthier one, is finally alone with a truth they refuse to examine. Neither person is thinking about the other as much as they believe they are. They are thinking about themselves, filtered through the shape of the other person, and this is the first hidden truth almost nobody discusses when they talk about mutual silence. Human beings do not actually miss people. They miss the version of themselves that existed around that person. This is a psychological distinction most relationship content never makes, and it changes everything once you understand it. When the avoidant stops reaching out, they are not simply protecting themselves from vulnerability. They are protecting themselves from becoming a version of themselves they do not respect. Many avoidant individuals carry a private belief that closeness reveals their inadequacy, so distance becomes a form of self-preservation disguised as independence. The tragedy is that this belief was never tested. It was assumed, then reinforced, then treated as fact. Meanwhile, the person who stays quiet on the other side often mistakes silence for strength. This is where the second hidden truth begins to surface. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes silence is simply fear wearing the costume of maturity. A person can convince themselves they are giving space, respecting boundaries, allowing healing, when in reality they are terrified that reaching out will confirm what they already suspect, that they mattered less than they believed. So both people sit in the same silence for entirely different psychological reasons, each interpreting the other's behavior through the lens of their own unresolved wound, and neither one realizes they are having two completely different internal experiences of the exact same event. There is a concept in psychology called projection without contact. It does not require conversation. It does not require presence. It only requires imagination. When two people stop speaking, their minds do not stop constructing each other. The avoidant begins building a version of the other person that justifies distance, often unconsciously exaggerating flaws or friction to make the separation feel necessary. The other person begins building a version of the avoidant that either idealizes what was lost or slowly deconstructs it into something they can live without. Both are engaging in an act of psychological fiction, writing a story about a real human being who is no longer present to correct the narrative. This is one of the most dangerous and least discussed aspects of emotional separation, because the longer the silence continues, the more both people fall in love, or out of love, with a character they invented rather than the person who actually existed. Consider a different kind of story than the usual relationship examples. A sculptor spends months carving a figure out of stone, convinced the final form already exists inside the material, waiting to be revealed. Every strike of the chisel removes what does not belong. But what if the sculptor halfway through begins imagining a different figure entirely, one that never matched the stone in the first place? The hands keep moving, the chisel keeps striking, yet the shape being carved no longer corresponds to the raw material underneath. This is what happens inside the mind during prolonged silence. Both people continue shaping an image of the relationship, of each other, of what happened and what it meant, using tools built from memory and emotion rather than truth. By the time either person speaks again, if they ever do, they are often responding to a sculpture that never matched reality, not the actual person standing in front of them. Now consider the deeper psychological function of avoidance itself, something rarely explained with honesty. Avoidant behavior is frequently misread as a lack of feeling, when the opposite is often true. Many avoidant individuals feel intensely, sometimes more intensely than they can safely process, and distance becomes the nervous system's attempt to regulate an internal experience that feels dangerous in its intensity. This does not excuse the pain caused by withdrawal, but it reframes the psychological mechanism behind it. The avoidant is not choosing coldness over warmth. The avoidant is choosing survival over exposure, because somewhere earlier in life, exposure was punished, dismissed, or overwhelming. Understanding this does not mean tolerating harm. It means recognizing that the behavior was never truly about the other person at all. It was about an old system of protection still running long after the original threat disappeared. On the other side of that silence sits a psychological pattern equally misunderstood. The person, often labeled anxious or overly attached or too invested, frequently carries a nervous system trained to seek certainty through closeness. Silence to this person does not feel like peace. It feels like a threat that has not yet been resolved. But here is the part almost nobody says out loud. That discomfort is not always a sign of love. Sometimes it is a sign of an old fear of abandonment activating, unrelated to the actual value of the relationship itself. Two people can be in the exact same silence, feeling completely different emotions, both convinced their reaction proves how much the relationship mattered, when in truth both reactions may be older than the relationship itself, inherited from childhood patterns neither person has ever fully examined. This is where personal responsibility enters the picture, and it enters without mercy. Blaming the other person for the silence, for the distance, for the way it all ended, feels satisfying in the short term because it protects the ego from confronting an uncomfortable question. What if the pain is not primarily about what he did or what she did, but about what remained unresolved inside each person long before they ever met? Relationships do not create wounds nearly as often as people believe. They reveal wounds that were already there, waiting for the right pressure to expose them. Silence becomes the pressure. And the true test of psychological maturity is not whether someone reaches out or stays quiet, but whether they are willing to look at what the silence exposed about themselves. There is a moment inside prolonged silence that psychology rarely names correctly, and it deserves a name because it changes the entire trajectory of healing. Call it the identity vacuum. When two people stop contacting each other, they lose more than communication. They lose a mirror they had grown dependent on, whether they admit it or not. Human beings partly construct their sense of self through reflection, through the way another person's attention, reaction, and presence confirms who they are. When that mirror disappears suddenly, the mind does not simply feel sadness, it feels disoriented because a portion of its self-recognition system has gone dark. This disorientation is often mistaken for heartbreak when it is actually something closer to a temporary identity crisis, and understanding this distinction changes how a person should respond to it. Most people try to fill an identity vacuum the wrong way. They search for new mirrors immediately, new attention, new validation, new distraction, anything that restores the reflection they lost. This is why so many people jump into new relationships too quickly after a painful silence, not out of readiness, but out of an unconscious need to feel seen again. The avoidant does something structurally similar, but disguised differently. Instead of seeking a new mirror, the avoidant often retreats into work, isolation, or self-sufficiency, convincing themselves this proves independence when in reality it is simply a different strategy for managing the same disorientation. Neither strategy resolves the underlying vacuum, both merely postpone the confrontation with it. Here is a harsh truth that deserves to be said without softening it. The silence you are afraid of is not actually the enemy. The enemy is what you do to avoid sitting inside that silence honestly, numbing it, rushing past it, rewriting it into a more comfortable story, blaming the other person entirely, or endlessly analyzing their psychology instead of your own. All of these are ways of running from the one confrontation that could actually change you. The mind will do almost anything to avoid an unguarded moment with itself. Silence forces that moment. This is precisely why it feels unbearable to so many people, not because the other person is gone, but because they are finally alone with an unfiltered version of their own mind. And many people have spent years arranging their lives specifically to avoid that experience. Think about a different kind of comparison than the usual emotional metaphors. A tuning fork struck in an empty room continues vibrating long after the strike itself has ended. The sound fades gradually, not instantly, even though the cause of the vibration is already gone. Human emotional systems behave the same way after sudden disconnection. The relationship has ended in practical terms, yet the nervous system continues vibrating with old patterns, old expectations, old emotional reflexes, long after the actual cause has disappeared. Many people mistake this lingering vibration for proof that they still need the other person, when it may simply be residual energy from a system still settling. Confusing residual emotional vibration with present truth is one of the most common psychological errors made during silence, and it leads people to make decisions based on echoes rather than reality. Now examine something almost never discussed honestly in avoidant attachment content, something that challenges the popular narrative directly. Avoidants are frequently portrayed as people incapable of introspection, yet many avoidants think about the relationship far more than they express, sometimes obsessively, privately, in a manner hidden even from themselves through intellectualization. The withdrawal is not always evidence of indifference. Sometimes it is evidence of an internal storm being suppressed so thoroughly that even the avoidant person loses conscious access to it. This does not mean every avoidant secretly longs to return. It means the emotional experience occurring beneath the surface is often far more complex, contradictory, and unresolved than the calm exterior suggests, and treating avoidant silence as simple emotional absence oversimplifies a psychological structure built specifically to hide its own depth. On the other side of that same silence, something equally overlooked occurs inside the person who did not choose to leave. There is a specific kind of grief that has no proper name in everyday language. The grief of losing access to someone who is still alive, still functioning, still existing somewhere in the world, yet permanently unreachable within the emotional context that once defined the relationship. This is different from grief caused by death. Death offers a fixed ending. Silence offers an open one. The mind struggles more with unresolved endings than with final ones, because unresolved endings leave room for imagination, hope, reinterpretation, and endless internal negotiation. This is why silence after a relationship can sometimes feel psychologically heavier than loss through death, even though society rarely validates that comparison. Consider the deeper philosophical layer hiding beneath all of this. Every relationship, at its core, is an agreement between two nervous systems to regulate each other temporarily. When that agreement ends, both systems must return to self-regulation, and self-regulation is a skill, not a feeling that simply arrives with time. Many people wait passively for silence to heal them, as though time alone possesses curative power. Time does not heal wounds automatically. Time only creates distance from the event. What actually heals a person is what they do with that distance, the honesty they bring to it, the patterns they interrupt, the self-awareness they build during it. Two people can experience the exact same number of months in silence and arrive at completely different psychological outcomes, because healing was never about duration. It was always about direction. There is one more layer worth exposing before moving further into this psychological structure, and it may be the most uncomfortable one yet. Silence often reveals whether someone's love was genuinely for the other person or for the experience of being needed by them. These are not the same thing, though they feel identical while the relationship is active. A person who loved being needed will struggle intensely during silence, not because they miss the specific human being, but because they miss the role that person allowed them to play, the fixer, the anchor, the emotionally stable one, the giver. When that role disappears, the identity built around it destabilizes. This is not a flaw to be ashamed of. It is a pattern to be understood, because only by understanding it can a person begin loving from a grounded identity rather than a borrowed one. Something interesting happens the moment either person begins healing sincerely instead of performing healing for an imaginary audience. The mind stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begins asking, "What does this reveal about the life I was building before this happened?" This shift in the question changes everything, because the first question keeps a person trapped in victimhood, while the second question restores agency. Most people never make this shift voluntarily. They are forced into it by exhaustion, by hitting the limit of how many times they can replay the same story without new insight. Real transformation rarely begins with inspiration. It begins with fatigue, the specific fatigue of being tired of your own explanations. Few people ever examine what silence does to self-trust, yet this may be the deepest wound hiding beneath the entire experience. When two people stop speaking, both are quietly forced to answer a private question neither one says aloud. Can I trust my own judgment again? The one who stayed longer than they should have begins doubting their perception of red flags. The one who withdrew begins doubting their capacity for closeness altogether. This erosion of self-trust is far more dangerous than the loss of the relationship itself, because a person without self-trust becomes vulnerable to repeating the same pattern with someone new, or avoiding connection entirely out of fear of repeating it. Rebuilding self-trust, not rebuilding the relationship, is the actual psychological task hiding inside every prolonged silence. Picture a lighthouse standing on a coastline long after the ships it once guided have changed their routes entirely. The light still turns, the mechanism still functions, yet nothing arrives to be guided by it anymore. Many people who experience mutual silence feel exactly like this lighthouse, still emotionally operational, still capable of connection, yet standing in a life that no longer receives the signal they used to send toward one particular person. The temptation is to believe the light itself has gone dim, that something is now broken inside them. But the light was never the problem. The direction it was pointed simply needs to change. This is not a metaphor about moving on quickly. It is a metaphor about recognizing that your capacity to connect remains fully intact, even when one particular connection has ended. Now consider a harsher truth still, one that most relationship content avoids because it is uncomfortable to hear. Some silences are not meant to be broken. Not every ending deserves resolution, closure, or a final conversation. The human mind craves closure because open loops feel unbearable, yet maturity sometimes requires tolerating an open loop permanently without forcing it shut artificially through a conversation that would only reopen old wounds. Chasing closure from someone who cannot or will not provide it often causes more damage than living without it ever could. Learning to let a story remain unfinished without needing to control how it ends is one of the most advanced forms of emotional discipline a person can develop. There is also a specific danger hiding inside long periods of silence that deserves direct exposure. The longer two people remain apart without contact, the more tempting it becomes to romanticize what was actually a flawed, incomplete, or even unhealthy dynamic. Memory is not a neutral archive. Memory edits itself constantly, softening pain, exaggerating good moments, filtering out the very friction that made the relationship difficult in the first place. This is why people sometimes reach back out after months of silence, convinced enough time has passed to justify trying again, only to discover the same unresolved patterns resurface almost immediately. Time does not repair character. Time only repairs the memory of character, and mistaking a softened memory for genuine change is one of the most common and costly errors people make after long separations. Real growth during silence looks nothing like what social media portrays. It rarely looks like new hobbies, new appearances, or public declarations of self-improvement. It looks like private, unglamorous confrontation with old fears, sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it, questioning long-held beliefs about worth, love, and safety, and slowly rebuilding an internal foundation that does not depend on another person's presence to feel stable. This kind of growth has no audience. It happens in ordinary moments, alone, unnoticed, and it is far more valuable than anything performed for validation, because it is the only kind of growth that survives the next relationship, the next silence, the next test of character. Ultimately, what happens when both people stop contacting each other is not a pause in the relationship. It is an unplanned confrontation with the self, arriving disguised as heartbreak. The avoidant is confronted with the cost of a lifetime spent avoiding closeness. The other person is confronted with the cost of seeking identity and safety through someone else's presence. Neither confrontation is comfortable. Neither confrontation is optional if genuine transformation is the goal. The silence did not create these wounds. It simply removed the noise that had been covering them for years. And once a person finally hears that silence clearly, without distraction, without a new relationship to hide inside, without a story that protects their ego, they are given something rare, an honest opportunity to become someone who no longer needs silence to reveal what they should have already known about themselves. Here is what you must understand before you close this video and return to your ordinary distractions. The silence you are avoiding is not punishing you. It is teaching you. Every day you spend running from it, filling it with noise, chasing new validation, or rehearsing old blame, is a day you delay meeting the version of yourself that silence was trying to reveal. Stop asking whether they will reach out. Start asking who you are becoming in their absence. Today, sit alone for 10 uninterrupted minutes with no phone, no distraction, and no story to protect your ego, and simply observe what surfaces. That single act of honesty will teach you more than months of waiting ever could. Growth does not begin when someone returns. It begins the moment you stop needing them to. Remember this long after today. Silence does not end relationships. Silence exposes the ones you were never truly ready to have.